You heard the news and your first reaction was not the one you wanted to have. The promotion, the book deal, the relationship, the thing they got that you have been working toward or quietly dreaming about or telling yourself you did not want as badly as you clearly did. And in the fraction of a second before the managed response, before the congratulations and the genuine smile, and the words that were all entirely true and entirely not the whole truth, something else moved through you, something hot and uncomfortable and deeply unwelcome, something you identified and immediately tried to bury, because this is not the kind of person you are. Except it is. Except it is exactly the kind of person you are, and the kind of person almost everyone is, and the effort to not be this kind of person, to suppress and deny and manage what is in fact one of the most common emotions in the human repertoire, is costing you more than you know, not just in the energy of the suppression, in the information you are refusing to receive. Because envy, honestly examined, is not simply the wound of wanting what they have. It is a map, a precise, uncomfortable, surprisingly honest map of what you actually want, what you actually value, and what you have not yet allowed yourself to honestly pursue. This audiobook is about that map, about what envy is, where it lives, why it is the emotion we are most ashamed of and least equipped to examine honestly, about what social comparison does to a mind that was never designed to be measured against the curated highlight reels of thousands of other lives simultaneously, and about what becomes available in terms of clarity, direction, and the particular freedom of a life no longer organized around someone else's. When you finally stop running from the feeling and start listening to what it is actually, envy is not proof that you are small. It is proof that you care. The question is what you do with that caring once you stop pretending it is not there. Part 1. The emotion nobody admits and everybody feels. In the taxonomy of human emotions, envy occupies a peculiar position. It is, by most measures, one of the most universal, documented across every studied culture, present in children as young as 2 years old, embedded in religious traditions and philosophical texts going back as far as written language, and yet it is simultaneously one of the most concealed. People will admit to anger, they will confess to fear, to sadness, to loneliness. They will describe their anxiety in considerable detail to anyone who asks. But envy, the specific, directed wanting of what a specific other person has, is almost never admitted directly, not to others, often not even to oneself. The reason is not complicated. Envy carries, uniquely among the major emotions, a heavy freight of moral judgment. To be angry is to have been wronged. To be sad is to have lost something. To be afraid is to face something threatening. These are all things that happen to you, but to envy is to want what is someone else's, to wish, at some level, that the good that has come to another person had come instead to you. And in a culture that prizes generosity and abundance mentality and the genuine celebration of other people's success, this is not a feeling that announces itself proudly. It hides, it disguises itself. It becomes, in polite company, a vague and sourceless unhappiness, a sudden loss of motivation, a critical observation about whether the successful person really deserved what they received. The philosopher Immanuel Kant called envy a propensity to view the well-being of others with distress, not because it diminishes your own, but simply because it is theirs. He considered it among the vices most contrary to human dignity. And yet, even Kant's formulation reveals the thing that makes envy so interesting to examine honestly. It is a response to another person's good fortune, which means it is, at its root, a response to what you believe you are lacking. The distress is not random, it is pointed. It knows exactly what it wants. The psychologist Richard Smith, who has spent decades studying envy, distinguishes between two forms that are psychologically very different despite being experientially similar. Malicious envy, the form Kant described, is characterized by hostility toward the envied person, by the wish at its extreme that they be brought down rather than that you be lifted up, by the emotional relief, painful to acknowledge, that sometimes accompanies another person's failure. Benign envy, by contrast, is characterized not by hostility but by a motivating pull upward, by the desire not to diminish what they have but to achieve something comparable yourself, by a feeling that functions, when it can be tolerated honestly, less like a wound and more like a compass needle pointing, insistently and without apology, in the direction of what you actually want. The difference between these two forms is not fixed in the person who feels them. It is determined largely by whether the envied achievement feels attainable, when the gap between where you are and where the envied person is feels bridgeable, when their success exists in a domain where you also operate, toward goals you also hold. Envy tends toward the benign and the motivating, when the gap feels unbridgeable, when the achievement is in a domain where you cannot compete or do not feel entitled to compete. It tends toward the malicious and the self-destructive, which means that what you do with the feeling depends, significantly, on what you believe about yourself and what you believe is possible for you. Part 2. The Comparison Machine: How We Built a World Designed to Wound Us. Social comparison is not a modern pathology. It is a fundamental feature of human cognition, one that evolved, like so many of our most troublesome tendencies, for very good reasons in a very different world. The psychologist Leon Festinger, who developed social comparison theory in 1954, argued that human beings have a basic drive to evaluate their own opinions and abilities, and that in the absence of objective standards, they do this by comparing themselves to other people. This was not presented as a flaw in the environment in which it evolved, the small face-to-face community, where your standing relative to those around you had direct consequences for survival, for access to resources, for mate selection. Continuous social monitoring was adaptive. Knowing where you stood in the hierarchy was essential information. The problem is the scale. The comparison instinct was built for a world in which your relevant comparison group was perhaps 150 people, the number that evolutionary anthropologists suggest represents the upper limit of stable social groups in pre-agricultural human communities. 150 people known personally, whose lives you understood in their full complexity, whose successes and failures you witnessed in real time, whose circumstances you knew well enough to contextualize what you were comparing. This is the comparison environment the brain was calibrated for. The comparison environment most people now inhabit is several orders of magnitude larger and more distorted. Social media presents not 150 lives but thousands, millions, each curated for maximum impressiveness, each showing the highlight rather than the whole, each optimized by platform algorithms to produce exactly the emotional response that keeps the viewer engaged. And engagement, as every platform engineer knows, is most reliably produced not by contentment but by agitation, by the particular emotional cocktail of admiration and inadequacy that makes you scroll further in the hope that the next image will resolve what the last image opened. The researcher Jean Twenge has documented, in data spanning decades and millions of respondents, the sharp decline in reported well-being that tracks almost precisely with the rise of social media. The mechanism is not complicated. You are comparing your interior with its doubts and fears and ordinary disappointments to other people's exteriors. Their achievements, their relationships, their bodies, their apparent happiness, their visible success. You are comparing the full, messy, complicated truth of your own life to the edited, filtered, strategically presented highlight reel of theirs, and the comparison structurally can only ever produce one result. The ancient world had no social media, but it was not without its comparison traps. The Stoic philosopher Seneca wrote extensively about what he called the disease of comparison, the tendency to measure the value of one's life by the possessions, status, and achievements of others. He observed that this disease has no natural limit. There is always someone richer, more celebrated, more fortunate by whatever measure you have chosen. The person who organizes their life around the comparison will never arrive because the endpoint keeps moving. The only cure he knew was the refusal of the comparison itself, the philosophical decision to measure your life against your own values, your own potential, your own standard of what a well-lived life consists of, rather than against the visible achievements of whoever happens to be standing nearby. Part 3. What envy is actually telling you. Here is the reframe that changes the entire relationship to envy. Envy is not a moral failing to be suppressed. It is a signal to be decoded, a message from the part of you that knows what it wants before the conscious mind has acknowledged it, arriving in the only form available to it when the wanting has not been given any more dignified expression. Think about the specific objects of your envy, not in the abstract specifically, the people you find yourself comparing to most persistently, the achievements that produce the particular sting rather than the neutral observation, the lives you scroll back to, the announcements that land differently, the successes that activate something in you that you would rather not look at too directly. Now ask the question that transforms the feeling from a wound into a compass. What precisely is it about this person's situation that you want? Not the person themselves, not their exact circumstances, the specific thing, the quality, the achievement, the aspect of their life that your envy is pointing at with such precision. Because envy is never vague. It is one of the most specific emotions available. You do not envy everything about another person. You envy this particular thing, this particular quality, this particular evidence of something you want and do not currently have and have perhaps not fully admitted to wanting. And the specificity is the gift, because in that specificity is information you could not have accessed any other way, a clarity about your own desires that is often more honest than anything you would have arrived at through conscious reflection. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, who had little patience for the suppression of difficult emotions, argued that what the moralists call envy is, in many cases, the voice of the genuine self protesting a life that has not yet found its proper direction, that the person who envies the writer has not yet allowed themselves to write, the person who envies the entrepreneur has not yet allowed themselves to build. The envy is not the problem. The suppression of what the envy is pointing toward, the silencing of the signal before its message can be received, that is the problem. There is a distinction worth making carefully here. Not all envy points toward genuine desire. Some of it reflects not what you want, but what you have been told you should want, the social markers of success that carry weight in your particular environment regardless of whether they correspond to anything in your actual value system. The expensive car, the prestigious title, the life that photographs well. These can generate envy in people who, if they examined the feeling honestly, would find that what they envy is not the thing itself, but the validation it represents, the evidence of being enough, the proof visible to others of a worth they have not yet located internally. This distinction matters because it changes what the envy is asking you to do. Envy that points toward genuine desire is asking you to pursue something real, envy that points toward. Validation seeking is asking you to do something more fundamental, to examine why external proof has become the primary evidence of your own worth and whether the chase for that proof is actually capable of providing what you are looking for. Part 4. The philosophical freedom of running your own race. Every tradition that has thought seriously about how to live well has arrived, in its own language, at a version of the same prescription for envy, not the suppression of the feeling. That is both impossible and counterproductive, the refusal of the comparison itself, the philosophical decision made clearly, renewed regularly, against the considerable headwinds of social pressure, to measure your life against your own standard rather than anyone else's. The Stoics called this living according to nature, meaning not the natural world but your own. Nature, your specific configuration of capacities, values, and inclinations, the unique combination of what you are genuinely good at, what genuinely matters to you, and what kind of life you would choose if you were choosing only for yourself and not for the approval of any audience. Marcus Aurelius, who had every available comparison available to him as the most powerful person in the ancient world, returned again and again in his private journals to this principle that the value of a life is measured not by how it ranks against other lives, but by how fully it expresses the nature of the person living it. The Buddhist tradition approaches the same ground from a different angle. The concept of mudita, often translated as sympathetic joy or appreciative joy, is the deliberate cultivation of genuine pleasure in the good fortune of others, not performed generosity, not the managed smile of someone who has suppressed the envy beneath, the actual, practiced capacity to experience someone else's success as simply good, as evidence that good things are possible, that the world contains what you hope for, that their flourishing does not diminish the possibility of your own. Mudita is the antidote to envy, not through the suppression of wanting, but through the expansion of the self large enough to hold other people's good without experiencing it as a threat to your own. This expansion is not natural to a mind calibrated for competitive social comparison. It is a practice, one that begins not with grand gestures of generosity, but with something much smaller, the deliberate noticing, in the moment when someone else's success activates the sting that their path is not your path, that their achievement does not reduce the field in which your achievement is possible, that the race, properly understood, has only one competitor, and that competitor is always and only the earlier version of yourself. The philosopher Soren Kierkegaard wrote about what he called the most tormenting of all human passions, comparison. His diagnosis was characteristically sharp. The person who compares, he argued, has surrendered the most fundamental responsibility of existence, the responsibility to become themselves, to make the choices, take the risks, follow the particular direction that their own nature and values indicate, and to measure the result against that standard alone. Comparison is, in his framework, a form of despair, the despair of someone who has decided that their own life, measured against itself, is insufficient grounds for evaluation, and who has therefore handed the measuring rod to whoever happens to be visible. Taking the measuring rod back is one of the most quietly radical acts available. It requires asking seriously and without performance what you actually value, not what is valued in your environment, not what produces the most impressive response when shared with others. What you, in the honest quiet of your own assessment, believe constitutes a life well lived, and then measuring your days against that, only that, with the full understanding that the answer will look different from anyone else's and that this is not a problem. It is the whole point. Part 5. From the wound to the map, the practice We have established that envy is a signal, not a verdict, that it points with uncomfortable precision toward what you want and have not yet allowed yourself to pursue, that the comparison machine of modern life has amplified the signal far beyond what the brain was designed to process, and that the philosophical traditions converge on the refusal of comparison as the path to freedom. Now the practical question, how, not in the abstract, specifically in the ordinary texture of a day in which envy and comparison arrive uninvited, and the philosophical prescription is easier to articulate than to inhabit. The first practice is what we might call the honest inventory, when envy arrives not afterward when it has been managed and denied, but in the moment or as close to it as awareness allows. Ask the precise question, what specifically am I reacting to? What quality, achievement, or circumstance is the envy pointing at? And beneath that, what does that tell me about what I actually want, not what I should want? What the envy in its uncomfortable honesty is revealing that I want. Write it down if that helps. The act of externalizing the feeling into language creates enough distance to examine it, rather than simply being inside it. The second practice is the separation of the signal from the noise. Once you have identified what the envy is pointing toward, ask the harder question. Do I actually want this specific quality or achievement in my life on my terms, or do I want the validation it represents, the respect of people whose opinion matters to me, the evidence that I am enough, the proof of something I have not yet found a way to believe about myself without external confirmation? If it is the former genuine desire, the envy is pointing toward action, toward the honest admission of what you want and the beginning of whatever it takes to pursue it. If it is the latter, validation seeking, the envy is pointing toward something internal, toward the work of building a relationship with yourself that does not require the achievement to confirm a worth you already have. The psychologist Abraham Maslow observed that the most self-actualized people he studied, those living most fully in accordance with their genuine values and capacities, were characterized not by the absence of desire, but by the presence of what he called intrinsic motivation. They pursued what they pursued because the pursuit itself was meaningful, not because of what it would prove to anyone watching. The envy that points toward intrinsic desire is asking you to become more self-actualized. The envy that points toward validation is asking you to examine why external proof has been standing in for the internal kind. The third practice is the deliberate cultivation of your own standard, not as a one-time declaration, as an ongoing, revisable, honestly maintained account of what you are actually trying to build. What does a good day look like, measured against your values rather than anyone else's visibility? What would you be proud of privately that requires no external confirmation to feel real? What is the direction your life is moving in when you are moving from your own center rather than in reaction to what everyone else seems to be doing? These questions, return to regularly, build something that comparison erodes, the sense of a life that is genuinely yours, moving in a direction you chose, measured against a standard you set, accountable to a version of success that belongs to no one else. And the fourth practice, the most demanding and the most freeing, is what the Buddhist tradition calls mudita, the practice, not the performance, of genuine pleasure in other people's flourishing, beginning small, beginning with someone whose success does not activate the sting, someone far enough from your own domain that their achievement reads as simply good, simply evidence of what is possible in the world, practicing the feeling of that, letting it be real, and then gradually extending the practice toward the people closer in, the peer, the colleague, the friend whose success does activate something, noticing the activation, sitting with it rather than fleeing it, And then, as a deliberate act, not suppression but expansion, asking whether there is room in a self large enough to hold both the wanting and the genuine. Wish for their good, the closing. There will be a moment, sometime after this, when you encounter someone else's success and feel the familiar movement of the feeling. It will arrive exactly as it always has, the specific sting, the quick internal accounting, the comparison that the mind cannot help making. That will not stop. The feeling is older than language, older than philosophy, wired in at a level no amount of understanding fully reaches. But something can change in what you do next. Instead of the suppression, the immediate management and denial that buries the signal before it can be read, a pause, a moment of honest inquiry. What is this pointing at? What does it tell me about what I want? Is what I want something I am actually moving toward? Or have I been watching other people move toward what I want while telling myself it is too much to want, or too late to pursue, or simply not the kind of thing that is available for someone like me? The wound of wanting what they have is, at its root, the wound of not yet giving yourself full permission to want what you want, to pursue it honestly, to fail at it and try again, to measure the attempt against your own standard rather than against the polished, visible success of someone whose path is entirely different from yours and whose interior, with its own doubts, its own comparisons, its own private accounting of what is missing, you cannot see at all. Theodore Roosevelt said that comparison is the thief of joy. He was right, but the full truth is both darker and more hopeful than that. Comparison is the thief of joy and the misdirection of energy and the postponement of the life you are capable of living. But the energy that comparison steals does not disappear. It waits, available the moment you stop spending it on someone else's race for the running of your own. Your race looks like no one else's. It has a direction no one else set and a standard no one else can measure because it belongs entirely to you. The envy was always the compass. The comparison was always the distraction. And the life you want, not the life that looks like theirs, but the life that is genuinely, specifically, irreplaceably yours, has been waiting with considerable patience for you to stop watching and start running. Run in your direction, at your pace, toward what you actually want. The only race that was ever worth entering is the one no one else can finish for you.